You ever use any intimidation props, walk into someone's office with a bat or something, and just let them know how this meeting is going to go?
That was not my style, but I'm sure there are those styles. No, no, I would say I was definitely more of a collaborator. Like we're just gonna talk, but people used to always laugh. They were like, "You have like the most direct, nicest way to be like no."
Hey folks, welcome to Executive Runtime. Here, we speak with highly accomplished executives to hear about their stories, lessons learned, and frameworks used to reach the highest levels of leadership and success. I'm your host, Johnny Austin. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Today, we're joined by Zaina Orbai, a remarkable executive coach and growth catalyst who has helped shape some of Silicon Valley's most successful companies. With over 20 years of executive leadership experience, Zaina played pivotal roles in scaling both Yelp and The RealReal through their IPOs, growing Yelp from $80 million to $1 billion in revenue and expanding it to over 20 countries. Born in Mumbai and raised in Los Angeles, Zaina brings a global perspective to leadership development. She's now a trusted advisor to CEOs, founders, and executives from all growth stages, from early stage startups to Fortune 1000 companies. Her client roster spans tech companies, nonprofit foundations, and even includes the U.S. Olympic Committee and teams. A passionate advocate for diversity and leadership, Zaina is a founding member of Chief, a network dedicated to driving more women into positions of power and invests in tech-enabled ventures through Operator Collective and the Nay3 Futures Fund. She's been recognized as one of the top 50 leaders shaping the future of work and received the CHRO Leader of Distinction Award. When she's not empowering leaders to transform their ambitions into achievements, you might find her trekking majestic peaks around the world or perfecting her homemade masala chai recipe. Please welcome to the show, Zaina Orbai. Zaina, welcome to the show. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm so excited, Johnny. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too, me too. So, just kind of jumping right into things, I'm curious, you have like a really great background in HR. Like, what brought you into HR in the first place?
Gosh, what brought me into HR in the first place? Well, if we kind of rewind back, I didn't know what HR was when I was going to undergrad. So I didn't know what I wanted to, going into college. And I said, okay, I'll just pick business because that's really broad. And for me, I was very clear that I wanted to have an impact. And so my actually first jobs out of college were in nonprofit space, and I thought that's kind of where I can, really make an impact on organizations that are mission oriented. And then I found very quickly that at least the nonprofits I was a part of, maybe they lacked the resources, maybe they lacked the talent, but it didn't necessarily go to, it wasn't, it's like they had these big goals, but I didn't feel like we were going to get there. And so then moved to the corporate side. And I thought if I go and get leadership and management skills, then whatever industry or role I end up in, it will serve me. And so then I went into retail, and retail is where you get put through some of the most robust management programs because you're managing a P&L, hourly employees, stores and organizations at a young age. And so anyway, I went into retail management, and that's when the head of HR at the company took of interest and said, you have figured out how to do this job really well. How about you come and recruit for our stores and really come into HR? And, to me, I thought HR was payroll. I didn't know what it was. And so she said, why don't you move to headquarters, move to, I was in LA, move to San Francisco, which is a place I wanted to live. So I just said, okay, but that's what put me into HR. I went into recruiting, and then, the journey continued. But yeah, it started with management, and then I moved into HR.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When I think about HR, well, not anymore, but I used to think about Toby from The Office. where he was like the sour grapes guy, and everyone just was like, ah, all right. But sounds like that's not the case for you. So,
I still, I have gone into companies where I remember talking about the sour grapes. I remember joining Yelp, and I think it was my second day, and
hmm
somebody literally came up to me and was just like, "Are you the HR lady?" And I was just like, "Well, I have a name." And by then I had already, had like 12 years of experience. So I was a coordinator. I was in a pretty senior role. They were just like, because someone resigned and I feel like I need to tell somebody in HR. Is that you? And
hmm
so anyway, it was just one of those, like, I feel like I was like, oh my God, I feel like I'm in an office episode right now. So it still happens. It still happens. And I sometimes still get, like, oh, HR. So,
yeah.
but anyway, it's what you make of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it sounds like you determined when you were in the nonprofit world that, corporate leadership was the direction you wanted to go in. I'm curious, did you view yourself as a leader at that time? One of the things that I think about a lot, and I've written about this, is, whether leaders are born, are they built, and this idea of like reluctant leaders, people who don't actually want to lead, but other people see something in them that they don't see in themselves. And so they kind of step into that leadership. I'm curious on what that journey was like for you and how you felt stepping into leadership.
That's a great question. I think leadership comes in a lot of different forms, but if we're talking about, corporate leadership and sort of galvanizing people over a vision, getting people to sort of move in, a certain direction, because you could even think about leadership in sort of the worlds of like creative arts and research, and that's very different, right? It's sort of
hmm
expertise and sort of reshaping the way you think about, science and arts. But if we're talking about corporate leadership and really how do you get people to follow you, right? And move in a direction,
Yeah.
I think there are some that really sort of enjoy and thrive it and sort of are, I think, in some ways energetically, like, sort of attuned to it, and others would rather not. For me,
hmm
I don't remember what I was like as a kid, but my parents used to say, "Oh my gosh, you are like," whether it was boys and girls, you were sort of always leading the pack. And a lot of times it was older kids and everybody
hmm
wanted to sort of follow what you were doing. And I don't remember those moments, but for
hmm
them, to me, leadership was sort of kind of a natural trait. But I think along the way, we all have our ups and downs. I do think there are many times I've doubted myself, and so I might be in a role where I feel like, I was not necessarily really a leader, and other times and so I think for me, it does feel like it sort of started at childhood, but I think it's ebbed and flowed, and it's
hmm
really because of kind of either the environment or sort of the relationship kind of I have with myself and others. So that's sort of when it shines. But I do think philosophically, everybody is a leader in sort of their own way. Um, and
hmm
um, and I think it's in some cases it's dormant for some, and I think in others it's fully awakened and aware. And so, but I do think if given the opportunity, if people start to kind of overcome fear and doubt and really kind of start to question themselves underneath it all, is like, you're a leader of your own life. So, yeah.
Yeah. How do you deal with those feelings of doubt and unsureness about your role?
I mean, I don't know that I had great tools when I was early in my career. I do think
hmm
earlier in my career, when I found myself in situations of doubt, a lot of times it was people around me that would lift me up and say, "Hey, you know what? Like, don't be so hard on yourself. Like, don't sit in disappointment. Guess what? You tried something and you failed, and like, you don't need to sit and sort of defeat, and feel like you can't do anything else." And so I think early on, there were people that saw more in me than I saw in myself. And especially, it's like I'm a risk taker, I like adventure, I'm a lifelong learner, but you go and try something and it doesn't necessarily always go your way, right?
Yep.
And I could be very hard on myself. And I think if you sit in that disappointment and defeat very quickly, you start to lose your confidence, you start to like sit in doubt, and then it becomes a lot harder because all of a sudden now you've made it sort of very personal rather than, hey, you
Hmm.
jumped into a situation and it didn't work out. So early on, I think there were a lot of people that lifted me up when I was in those moments. And now that I'm in the work that I'm in, which is really helping others kind of overcome inner blocks and energy blocks, I'm much more
Hmm.
conscious. Like, oh, wait a second, I'm falling into this pattern. I have a choice here. How do I choose something differently in this moment that I'm experiencing than not? So I'm much more aware now, but early on, it was other folks that lifted me up.
Yeah, I'm curious. One of the things that, just kind of switching gears a little bit, that I've noticed in my career is that at some point, you start off in leadership and you're more of like a functional leader. So in your case, HR, in my case would be engineering, but at some point you need to transition into being more of a business leader with functional expertise. And I found that I was completely unprepared for that transition. I'm curious on how you handled that. Were you aware of this, and how did you handle those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think with functional leadership, I think really, as people are building functional leadership, you're building an expertise, right? And you're building
Hmm.
mastery over that specific field, whether it's engineering and HR. In some ways, to kind of bridge that, you have to sort of put yourself in just like when you think about, okay, you go from like sort of you're a senior in high school and then all of a sudden you have
Hmm.
to like become a freshman in college. And so I do feel like moving from functional to sort of broader business leadership does take some courage and does take some humility of like, okay, I don't know everything. And guess what? There's,
Hmm.
10 different functions here. And I'm going to have to get curious. I'm going to have to learn. I'm going to have to rely on the things I know, but there's a lot of things I don't know. And so I think um, to me, in some ways, it's a way of really putting yourself in a position of discomfort, knowing that you're going to kind of grow and have a broader impact on the organization and also grow as a leader. So, yeah, I think for
Hmm.
me, it was also similar to you. Like when you get into it and people start saying, well, no, I want you to think bigger and broader. And you're but like this makes so much sense in my world, and it's like no, but the world is much bigger. And I think for me it was very clear when I started reporting to CEOs
Hmm.
where they would say, well, that's really HR process or that's really HR focus, and so I thought, okay, if I'm going to be effective reporting to a CEO, then I'm going to have to start thinking like a CEO. What are the top three challenges in
Right.
the organization? What is keeping them up at night? And so for me, became very much like, how do I get into the mindset of a CEO to then be effective and help that leader, but also the organization? But yeah, I think early days, I used to get a lot of feedback of like, you need to think bigger and broader.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that I've noticed is that those cross-functional relationships as well, leaders from like other functions that are not yours, are really important as well in terms of learning about the business, building that rapport, and just being able to have the influence you need to be able to lead effectively. And that was something that was came in really important like later on in my career, and that's something I continue to see to this day for
And what
sure.
was the pivotal moment, Johnny? Because it sounds like now you're like, oh, wow, I can see the benefits of it. But was there sort of a moment for you that kind of solidified that?
Similar to you when I started reporting to a CEO,
Mm.
right? It was because it was more than just, delivering on the roadmap and, writing code and making sure the engineers are performing and all of that, right? I had to have a strong opinion on the business strategy itself, how we go to market, how we talk to customers, that sort of thing. Because even though it wasn't strictly an engineering problem, there were definitely implications, how we built the product, how fast we moved, things like that, that really needed my input. And so I went from making strictly sort of like engineering organization decisions to business decisions with engineering in mind. And so, and a lot of this really comes to fruition when you start thinking about things like, if you ever went through like a SOC 2 compliance process or anything like that, it's hugely disruptive to the business because you have to introduce all of these processes that engineers need to do, and you need to do it. Otherwise, you can't get any B2B customers. But at the same time, it disrupts how fast you can move, how fast you can ship. Basically, sometimes the health and well-being of the engineers because they hate doing the process type stuff. But these were things that we had to do for the business that really had not much to do with engineering specifically. And so that's when I started to really kind of see things a lot differently.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's like going from sort of process to strategy in some ways, right?
Yep.
So,
Yeah. Yeah. What is something that radicalized you as a professional?
wow, radicalize is such a big word. Radicalize me.
That's intentional.
Yeah, yeah, I know that's intentional. You're like, oh, well, I'm not going to give you the easy questions. I don't know that there's one thing, but I would say situations where there were high levels of adversity, complexity, uncertainty,
Hmm.
that really challenged me to think differently. It's a bit of a like, not sink or swim, but it's like if you don't think differently here, you're not going to get to where you want to go, right?
Hmm.
And so that it comes with intensity, right? All these things. And so I do find that while those were in some ways uncomfortable, and it's not like I'm like, oh, those were like my happy days, those are the
Yeah.
days that stretched me the most. And when I think of
Hmm.
radical kind of change, I think of like what really kind of rethinks the way you think about leadership, how you approach the business, how you show up. And I think it's those moments where there was a lot of uncertainty, there was a lot of stress, but
Hmm.
you grow from it. And you can't use that old playbook that worked up until everything then. And all of a sudden you're like, okay, none of this is working. I can keep like one of my 10 points, and I'm going to have to unlearn and relearn at the same time.
Yep.
So, yeah, so that's sort of the irony where I would say, okay, I wouldn't intentionally put myself in those situations, but those are the
Hmm.
situations where I grew the most. So,
Yeah. I mean, this kind of, goes to the next question, talking about unexpected growth. I'm curious, we all have this, what we think is a plan that we're going to execute on in terms of how you're going to grow as a professional and the skills that you're going to gain and how it's going to benefit you. But I'm curious, and you can talk about, one or two of the instances where you had just like this radical unexpected growth, like you went through something and you were like, wow, I would never want to go through that again, but I'm really glad I did because I learned X, Y, and
yeah, I
Z.
mean, I think, during COVID, I think a lot of people experienced unexpected growth. Specifically,
Hmm.
though, I was at the RealReal, and 80% of the employees were essential employees. And if you remember, essential employees in the United States was classified as an employee that had to be in an office or in a
Hmm.
distribution center or a manufacturing thing to keep the lights on and the business going. And so that
Yep.
was very challenging. It's a business that was you know uh, kind of around sustainability and pre-owned goods and luxury, and at the same time we didn't have people coming into distribution centers. There was no business, and they couldn't process supply. And so that was, I think, one of the most challenging years where we were on I think it was, 30-40% up, and we were now 40% down. So there was a huge swing of 70 to 80% in the business. The business had just gone IPO about 9 months prior. So we were just learning to be a public company. And I think there were moments that we were like, oh my God, if we don't figure this out, there is going
Hmm.
to be no company, at the end of the year. And so I think those were moments that really challenged me as a HR leader, as a business
Hmm.
leader, as just sort of a human. But more broadly, and I would say that's sort of the experience, right? Kind of the intensity. But the other way I also want to kind of answer your question around unexpected growth is I do find that I tend to be like a go, go, go person. And so,
Hmm.
I'm like an action, like make it happen, learn by doing. And
Yeah.
like the moments where I have had unexpected growth, not expected, where, okay, you're in an intense environment. Of course, everybody's going to grow during COVID, is like where I've slowed down. And I was thinking about it, like, it's kind of ironic because I'm like, oh, the more I do, the more I'll learn. And there's this bit of like more is better. And so I have really had to kind of switch gears. And it's like, oh, okay, if I am more present and I slow down, I will be able to reap the benefits of what I need to learn in this moment or in this situation. And not that I can do it all the time, but I am much more intentional and deliberate that like there's go, 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 but then you do have to have moments of like pause and say, what just happened? What am I going to learn from that before I like keep going? And that has either come from mentors, coaches, bosses, whatever, right? Where it's like, take a beat, Zaina, right? And slow down
Hmm.
because, and so that's where I always find it like interesting, where it's like, okay, slow down. And then you get to like really think like, where have you just come from and where are you going, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's, we just don't do more of, I don't do enough of it. And I think, our environment doesn't necessarily support more of that, but I think that's where really like a lot of growth comes from, is just like reflecting and
Hmm.
pausing.
Yeah. You talked a little bit already about a couple times about you know, people who saw stuff in you that you didn't see at the time. And I'm curious on just more broadly, who are the people that really helped pull you along in your career, even when you didn't want to go along? So great bosses, mentors, advocates, how important were these people to your career success?
I think they were very important because I think there are people that come into our life and they sometimes paint a vision, and then you say,
Hmm.
yeah, you know what, i I see that, I smell that, I can realize that. And sometimes it's just a matter of them voicing it. And so, like I said, early on, I was in a recruiting role. I had just moved to San Francisco. I didn't even know what HR was. And I didn't have like, oh, I want to be CHRO or corporate, C-suite leader. Like that wasn't in my even viewpoint. It was just like, I want to learn and grow, and we'll see where life takes me. So I was much more sort of fluid and flow. And that's when I remember they said, hey, the head of HR, at Mervin's, and at the time that was a 20,000 person company. I was like multiple layers lower. I was like, why does this woman want to meet with me? Now I knew I had been very
Hmm.
successful, but it was still many roles lower. And I
Yep.
remember that meeting where she called me into her office, and really it was just, the intention was like, you have a lot of potential. Are you thinking bigger and broader for yourself? And she had said, you should think about going back to business school. You should think about taking more risk in your career. You should, try a lot of different things, and you'll either love being an expert, or you might realize that you might be in a position like mine, a head of HR. And I remember thinking, I don't know, like that sounds crazy, but I still remember that conversation because I was,
Hmm.
just in a really junior role at the time. And she clearly saw something in me that I had not even realized. And that's happened to me multiple times, where, people will say, well, have you thought about this? And I will say, no, but that doesn't seem, in some cases it seems crazy. And then, 5 years later it happens and you say, wait a second, someone saw something that I didn't see. So I am, and now I like to pay that forward. And I am much more vocal if I see something in someone and I'm interacting with them one on one. I just say it, because they can
Hmm.
think I'm crazy, or it could spark something and say, you know what, I just needed someone else to say it, and that is what I want to do. And so,
Yeah.
and I think I'm giving you, Johnny, the example of, head of HR. Like to me, that was a big job. I was in a junior role,
Hmm.
but it also has come in like moments of like, you're at a coffee shop and maybe you're sort of down, or like, like we're always, sometimes we're in these moments of like brain fog, like, man, I don't know what I want to do. There's like six different ways that I can like move in my career. I can go this way, I can switch jobs, I can go to a big company, I can go to a startup.
Hmm.
And we're sort of like stuck, right, in some ways, and that happens to everybody. And then you
Yep.
just end up like, having a networking event, you talk to somebody, and all of a sudden they're sort of like the, what is it? I call it sort of the voice of truth or the voice of clarity. And you're like, wow, you just met me, but that is so clear. And so sometimes it's people who know you, but a lot of
Hmm.
times it's also just completely objective, someone who's just like you just met and they say something and you're like, okay, everything cleared, the fog cleared, now I can see, you
Yeah.
know? So yeah, so I would say it's come in multiple forms in my life.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. Probably my first real mentoring experience was way back in my first job. I was only like 3 years into my career, and I was in government contracting, and I was looking to transition out, and I had been like interviewing, and I was interviewing with this company in New York with this gentleman, and he was really nice, and I was super nervous. And I guess about halfway through, he let me know like this is not going to happen, and I was pretty devastated. But he was like, "But look, I sense the passion and the talent here. Let me tell you what you should do." And he gave me some books to go check out. This was all like technical stuff and whatnot. And I asked him if he would review some code for me because I was like building some open source projects, trying to just get my work out there. And he did that over the next like several years. And we just kind of kept in touch over and over again. And fast forward about 10 years, I guess, I gotten back in touch with him just to check, see how things were going. And he was like, things are going great. And he was like, you know what? I got to let you know, you're the best employee I never hired. And so that was like very interesting. And he's just, I don't know, I always reflect on that experience because we've never met in person. He did not owe me any of his time. He was just, someone who saw like some kid who was, he thought was really sharp, was not qualified for the job, but he thought that, I had a lot of potential, and it really stuck with me. And it made a big impression on me as a young person. So yeah, you just never know where these types of folks will come from.
Yeah, and I love that story, Johnny, because guess what? Not only did you just kind of I think you kind of enrolled him to be a mentor for you, and but he also had a big learning, right? Is like, hey,
Hmm.
if you invest the time in sort of raw young talent, you
Hmm.
may get surprised where they end up and where they go, right? And so to me,
Yeah.
years later, he learned that lesson of like, wait a second, you did have the talent, maybe you didn't have the experience, but you had the talent and the
Hmm.
potential. So I love that story because I think there was a big lesson for him, but also he seemed like someone that maybe had sort of underestimated his ability to like, you know, coach, develop, and mentor. And I think that I see a
Yep.
lot of that, right? I think there are people that have had those experiences and they get development. Like, hey, if you invest your sort of experience and mind share and expertise in someone else, that doesn't have that, young or old, doesn't matter. They have a potential to grow. And others who haven't necessarily experienced that sometimes don't believe that, people can grow and they're a lot more rigid.
Hmm.
So I love that. That's such a great story.
Yeah. What's the hardest professional lesson you've ever had to learn?
So when I was in retail, because my first 10 years were in retail, I would see a lot of successful women in very senior
Hmm.
roles, but many times they were single, not married, didn't have kids, lucky if they had a dog kind of thing, right?
Hmm.
And I think in retail, it can be a very intense environment because, you're coming from stores that are operating 24 hours, right? And, each industry has its own culture. And I think a lot has changed even from that was, 20 plus years ago when I was coming up in retail.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking, like, oh my gosh, like, do you have to sort of like give up, family life to have be ambitious? And I think as I started to like really question that, and I thought, okay, maybe it's not retail. And that's a lot of reason what brought me into tech is like, okay, I don't know if retail, at least on the store side, on the corporate side, it's different. I think it brought me into corporate of like, I want to have a family. I do want to have balance. Like, I don't know if I want to have kids and all of that, but my thought was like, I want to have fun and also
Hmm.
be really great at my job and successful and ambitious and all of that. And I think I had to really kind of challenge that and ask more people. And it was like, okay, well, there are some women that have figured it out. So yeah, I think when I think about, sort of that lesson of like, okay, women can be ambitious and successful and also have, a healthy family life. It is possible, but not everybody sort of thinks that way, right? And they didn't 20 years ago.
Hmm.
So I would say I'm glad that I learned that from others. And how do you do that? How do you create the support system? How do you, build the right partnership with your spouse, right? All of those things have to happen for whether it's a man or a woman to be successful professionally and also personally. But that takes a lot of intention and support and thinking about like how do you build that village, right? It doesn't just happen overnight. And luckily, there's a lot more support, across the board for both men and women to, have big careers and also, big lives outside of work. But I'm glad I didn't learn that the hard way because I definitely met women that, as I started really kind of, I almost went on a little bit of like a research tour of like, what are your regrets? What are your, and I would meet very successful women say, I wish I had kids when I could have kids. And now I feel like, okay, I have, all this, but I sacrificed when I didn't need to. So to me, I'm glad I didn't learn that, the hard way.
Yeah, yeah. I'm curious. One of the things that comes up a lot when we're talking about leadership and trying to quote unquote climb the corporate ladder is sort of like the first big hurdle is going from an individual contributor IC to a manager, and then from manager to like leader of leaders. And so instead of leading ICs, you're leading other leaders. Can you talk about that transition for you? Did you find it difficult? What type of tools that you use to kind of up your game? And
Yeah, I mean, I think now in hindsight, looking back at those transitions, I've like realized like power and influence does not come from big titles. Yes, you get some authority. Yes, you get some credibility. But I used to always think, oh, like when you're in this title, then you have more people will listen to you or like power and
mm-hmm.
influence. And I think what I realized is I think power and influence really comes with relationships. Like it starts with, you know, the relationship you have with yourself. Like, are you confident that you can, do the job? And if not, that you're confident enough that you can learn, ask, mentor, get what you need to, you know, excel and kind of become, fill in the gaps, right? Then there's the like other, what is your relationship with others? Others on your team, whether it's your direct, it's your peers, it's your boss, it's, other folks that can help you. I think the other bit is like the environment, what's your relationship with like in that context and environment? Is that the right place for you to really kind of for me to use my strengths, right? Because I think I've sometimes gone to places where I was like, whoa, this is not like where I can use my strengths, and no wonder I feel like, I'm like barely keeping up, and then I think the other bit is like the relationship with change, that like things are always motion. Like you might have this perfect team and then someone, leaves or gets promoted. And then all of a sudden the team dynamics change is even though you have one person that's changed. And that happens on executive teams all the time, right? Because executives now only stay in a position 18 to 24 months. So executive teams are constantly these like living organisms that are kind of
Mm-hmm.
shrinking, expanding, changing. And so when you think
Yep.
about, in HR, you're constantly being like, okay, well, what's the dynamic and how do we continue to kind of grow and keep it healthy? But yeah, I would say for me, for when you talk about IC to manager, manager to leader, and then functional leader to what we talked about earlier, which is business leader, it really stems on relationships, like knowing yourself, well, I always tell people, I interview for like, do you know what you know? Do you know what you don't know? And if you don't know, do you have the kind of skill set to like ask for help, figure out where you're gonna get what you don't know from who, whether it's books, people, resources, networks, and if so, then you'll figure it out, So yeah, I think those transitions for me, they seem to have gone smoothly. Like I'm sure I think if anything, the hurdle was me getting in my own head, to be honest, Johnny, where it's like, oh my gosh, like because I moved up in my career very quickly, by I would say my mid 30s, I was already in a chief people officer role. And when you think about retail days, I was 22 years old and I was the youngest store manager at Mervyn's. I had 100 people reporting to me. Like, I remember there were people like older, more experienced, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, are they going to listen to me? So for me personally, I was sort of like, oh my gosh, am I too inexperienced, too young? And this bit of like, yeah, to be good at this role. And so for me, it was really getting out of my own way, and like getting out of my own head. And that took time, right? Even when I started leading leaders, I was like, well, these people they're experts, right? Because when you start leading leaders, you're like managing experts. And I thought, this person has been 10 years in this profession. I'm just learning,
Hmm.
how what it's like to, manage this kind of an expert leader. But then you realize that you have different skill sets. And there's a reason why I was put in that position is because I could synthesize, I could think more broadly. I'm willing to be okay in ambiguous situations where that person has a lot of comfort to stay in the expertise role. But yeah, that comes over time. But for me, it was much more like in my head than like, you know, in
Yeah.
actuality.
Yeah. How do you handle like conflict at the executive level? I mean, I'm sure this happens a lot, but people don't always agree. But are things like ego a consideration when you found yourself in situations
No,
where you're
there's
trying to
no
resolve things?
egos at the executive level. Yeah, there are a lot of big egos. I think there are egos. I think that people have goals. I think people have not only their like, sort of work goals and roadmap goals, but there's also their personal goals. And also how they like address conflict, right? Like, there's some people that are going to compromise, there are going to some people that are going to, fight, some people that are going to like avoid, right? And for me, I think you got to really get curious about the person. And so I think about like for me, the fastest way to resolve conflict is like figuring out how is this person motivated? Like, what is their motivation in this conversation and getting really clear on that. And once you understand their motivation, then it's a lot easier, right? And that motivation is not always the same as yours. That's kind of part of it, or the same as maybe what is set, like what it should be. And so I think once you get clear on that, then it's a lot easier to say, okay, how do we create a win-win here where or you call them out and saying, wait a second, you know, is this the motivation of the meeting or is it this, right? And you can sort of put the
Yep.
truth on the table and then they can say, oh yeah, you're right. I'm overly focused on, X when really I should be focused on Y. So to me, conflict resolution all starts with like understanding the individual's motivation. And if there's 10 people in the room, understanding all 10 people's motivation, so that you can then move the conversation forward. And I'll tell you, with egos, it's funny you said egos. I don't do this any so much anymore, but when I was more junior in my career, there are people that with you think, okay, big egos, and you also get to learn people's patterns and behavior. And so what I mean by that is there were certain people, it was very clear like where you sat in the room created a different dynamic. I know you're gonna like laugh at this, but like if you sit across from them, then all of a sudden it feels like it's like gonna be a debate. And this is not with everybody, but I kind of learned like, oh, if I sit across from them, it's gonna be like this debate. If I literally walk around and sit next to them and we're just kind of like elbow to elbow, it feels a lot more conversational and their whole experience is going to change. And so I started to really learn human patterns, right? When you think about that. Or, hey, if you ask them to come, to your office 4 floors down versus going to their office, it's a different dynamic, not good or bad. Oh, guess what? Some people don't want meetings at 3 o'clock on a Friday. I get it. So you're going to find someone more cranky if you schedule it at Friday at 3 o'clock, even though it's open, versus 10 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'm not going to bring a difficult conversation on someone's calendar on Friday at 3 if I already know I'm going to walk into like them being like, really? Is this the right time? So I was very intentional about space, physical space, body language, time of day, or like, hey, this person always works out on a Wednesday morning. They're always in a great mood. So if you want to put something really difficult, do it right after their workout. Because you know what? They're coming out, they're always going to be in a good mood. So yeah, when you start to really think about that, because humans are humans, right? And so you really think about like, what's the right setups that you make that conversation go more smoothly. So yeah, I was a lot very intentional about those things, but it it might think like, oh my God, that's overthinking it, but it made things go much more smoothly and more efficiently versus having five conversations. I could resolve it in one or maybe even in a half an hour. So
Yeah. You ever use any intimidation props? Walk into someone's office with a bat or something, and just let them know how this meeting is gonna go.
that was not my style, but I'm sure there are those styles. No, no, I would say I was definitely more of a collaborator. Like we're just gonna talk, but people used to always laugh. They were like, "You have like the most direct, nicest way to be like, no, we're not doing that." And they're
Yeah.
like it sounds like like you're just like having a cup of coffee, getting to know, but then when you listen to your words, it's like, no, bad idea and so people used to always be like, you're a master at like saying no in the nicest way and like being direct about it. So yeah, my approach was much more like, yeah, we're gonna just chat, even though it was gonna be a hard conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. We're getting close to the end here, but before we wrap, I wanted to talk a little bit about Chief, and if you can talk a little bit more about the organization. I've seen some really impressive individuals who are part of the organization. How did you get hooked up with them? How has it helped you reach your goals? And I'm just curious about it in general.
Yeah, Chief. So Chief is it came about during COVID, and I had literally just got an email from someone saying, "Hey, we're trying to get, women in C-suite roles together. We're gonna
Hmm.
test it out. Would you like to, join for 3 months?" And it ended up being such a great experience. I met some incredible women. And we were all sort of stuck in our homes, and so it was all through Zoom. And that was 5 years ago. And I remember like it was like the first San Francisco chapter. There were like 20 women. And it was all, and we built some of the like most kind of the strongest camaraderie. Part of it was because it was COVID. Part of it was we were stuck in our homes. Part of it was like, we just need to find other people kind of going through the same experience. And there's a lot of power in that to just share your story and someone say, yeah, I'm experiencing the same thing. Here's what I'm doing, getting a sense to kind of create a peer group. But now, I mean, it's grown exponentially. And every time, someone reaches out and says, would you think, it's worth it? I tell them, like, you have to invest the time, right? In anything in life, if you're going to invest the time, the effort, absolutely, there's a lot of benefit. And now they have speakers, programs, retreats. But yeah, I think there was clearly something missing where there are, of course, a lot fewer women in C-suite roles, and so it's just made it a lot easier to find, other people kind of experiencing what you are and kind of create camaraderie and a support system. So I think now, I don't know what the numbers are, but I believe it's like 10 or 20,000 women. I know they tried growing abroad. There's a new CEO that's just joined. But yeah, it's really turned into an ecosystem, I guess, from like, just groups of 20 in different cities. Now it's really turned into kind of multinational organization to help and support women. And I think whether it's women, underrepresented, male leaders, it doesn't matter. I think we all have moments in our life that it gets tough and it gets hard. And that could be because you're in a new role. It could be because your whole environment changed. It could be that you're a new parent or you're dealing with, aging parents, whatever that is, right? Like we're all going to have experiences where we're experiencing it for the first time and it makes it hard. But guess what? There are other people that have been there, done that, and in different ways, right? And so where I might have been somewhere, you're doing it for the first time, I can help you, or vice versa. I'm going through it for the first time and you can help me. And there's a lot of power, in that of like groups coming together and in some ways sort of kind of raising, the experience and expertise just by sharing. So I'm a big believer in, it doesn't matter whether it's men, women, whoever it is, like for people to find a community where you can share because you get so much out of that, but also where you can receive. I think that that's a win-win and helps everybody.
Yeah. Cool. Any final words of advice or departing words for the audience?
I don't have any final words, but I have a question for you. So,
Oh
Johnny,
man.
I know
Okay.
this is the first podcast. So, what kind of
Yeah.
sparked the idea for starting a series?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been considering a podcast for years. First, it was going to be more on the technical side, but I don't know. I've always had this voice in my head, like, nobody wants to hear from me, and like it's all been done before, and I wasn't sure it was necessarily worth it. And then I guess it was a couple months ago. I was speaking to someone, and they were asking me about potentially doing a podcast. And I told them like what I just told you. Well, I thought about it, but I talked myself out of it. And I was basically told, well, yeah, a lot of people are doing it, but you aren't. And so there are a lot of people who want to hear from you specifically, or hear your point of view, or, hear conversations that you want to be a part of. And everyone has something to add to the conversation. And so after I thought about it a bit, I thought that, okay, this person is right. Maybe it's something I should, dip my toe into. It's not like I'm career changing. I'm not going to be like, Joe Rogan or anyone like that. But, there are people like you who I know, who I really enjoyed working with in the past, and people I'm, really want to meet. And so this was also a really great opportunity to meet and have conversations with those folks. And so, yeah, I decided to kind of make a jump forward. And if I'm going to do it right. So I contacted my friend Lori about the designing and, did the website and all that. And so, yeah, I did the trailer a few weeks back and got a lot of good feedback from people who are really excited to hear it. So that sort of further bolstered me and, confirmed that it was a good decision to move forward.
I love that. I love that. What are you hoping that kind of listeners get out of your podcast?
Yeah, I'm really hoping that people learn something that they don't get from the books, right? There are a lot of business books out there to tell you how to climb the corporate ladder and use these frameworks. And it's all great stuff, and it is very useful. But what I found that when I meet people who I find really impressive, I'm really more impressed with their personal stories and the things that they specifically went through in order to achieve what they've achieved. And I get the most insight out of those rather than the more generic frameworks and books. And so I'm really trying to assemble those stories into a place where other people can also gain those same insights.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, stories are so powerful. So that's
Yeah,
great. That's great.
cool. Well, where can people connect and learn more about you?
Yeah, so plug. So, I've done a lot of different things. I am coaching now, so I want to share with whoever's listening. I work with business leaders that are in high impact roles that are at an inflection point. And we talked a little bit about that in the podcast. So when you're at an inflection point, there's going to be naturally inner blocks. And so I help leaders overcome those inner blocks to get to where they're going. So really, I'm kind of closing the gap between ambition and achieving your next goals. And so if that's something of interest, or you're stuck, you want to reach out, have a conversation, just Zaina Orbai at Gmail, or you can send me a message on LinkedIn. But I'm always interested to, talk with leaders, and specifically, it's, meet new folks that are doing interesting things.
Great. Well, Zaina, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting with you today, as always, and I'm looking forward to more amazing things from you in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, Johnny.